Some secrets don't shout. They whisper through silence, through eyes that look away, and clocks that suddenly start to tick again. In a quiet town like Bellwood, grief wears a polished face, but beneath it, something else stirs, something unspoken. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. A funeral without tears. The grey light slanted through Jessica's kitchen window, casting soft shadows across the blue and white tiled floor. Outside, the gulls had already begun their rhythmic calls over the harbour, and the wind moved lazily through the trees lining her narrow street. She stirred a spoon through her tea, more out of habit than need, and listened to the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When the mail slot clinked against the door, she didn't move right away. Mornings in Cabot Cove were usually uneventful, a welcome contrast to the chaos she so often encountered elsewhere, but some small instinct, nudged her. She opened the door and retrieved a neat bundle, a flyer from the bookshop, a postcard from Elaine in Boston, and one thick cream-colored envelope with her address written in ink that looked almost ceremonial. No return name, only a P.O. box in Bellwood, New Hampshire. Jessica studied it carefully. It wasn't her birthday. It wasn't a wedding. Her brows drew together. There was a weight to the paper, not just in thickness but in something else, something final. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table, her tea already cooling beside her. Inside was a beautifully printed funeral invitation, gold leafing around the edges, crisp serif typeface. You are respectfully invited to attend the memorial service for Mrs. Miriam Cargill, widow of Albert Cargill, to be held at St. Agnes Chapel, Bellwood, New Hampshire. Jessica paused. The name sounded unfamiliar, yet oddly deliberate. It was the kind of invitation sent to old family friends, respected colleagues, people one had known in another life. But it wasn't the name of the deceased that puzzled her most. It was the name listed at the top of the envelope, Mrs. Margaret Fletcher. Jessica blinked. There was no Margaret Fletcher in Cabot Cove, not anymore. Frank's Aunt Margaret had passed nearly a decade ago, and she had never lived in Maine. She turned the envelope over. Her address was written correctly, number, street, zip code. So how had it come to her? The mistake seemed innocent on the surface, and yet Jessica felt that familiar stir, a thread beginning to tug. She brought the invitation into the study and dialed the number listed at the bottom. A young woman answered. Her voice was clear but clipped. Bellwood Memorial Services. This is Rebecca. Jessica introduced herself gently and asked to speak with someone regarding an invitation sent to her in error. Name of the deceased, the woman asked. Miriam Cargill. There was a pause, not long enough to be suspicious, but just long enough to feel rehearsed. Yes, Rebecca said at last. Mrs. Cargill passed 4 days ago. The funeral will be this Friday. Jessica hesitated. I believe the invitation was intended for a different Fletcher, a Margaret perhaps. More silence, then the faint rustle of paper. I see the name here. But, yes, the address matches yours. I'm sure it was simply a mix-up, Jessica said kindly. Perhaps, the woman replied. But it was a personal request, handwritten by Miss Clare Cargill, her daughter. I remember because she insisted on sending a few herself, apart from the formal list. Jessica thanked her and hung up. Her fingers lingered on the receiver. Clare Cargill, that name didn't help. But the feeling in her chest had changed. Jessica stood by the window, the letter in one hand, her tea forgotten on the sill beside her. She couldn't place Miriam Cargill, not through teaching, publishing, or Frank's military years, and yet the name stirred something, not memory exactly but association, an atmosphere. She'd known many women like Miriam, the kind who moved through the world in well-tailored silence, who built legacies in gardens and silence, who left behind beautiful homes and carefully constructed estrangements. Names that appeared in estate notices, women whose portraits lingered in empty drawing rooms. Still, none of it explained the invitation, or why it felt, despite its error, so intentional. She walked to her desk and opened the drawer where she kept the slim Rolodex she hadn't used in months. No Cargill, no Bellwood. And yet, as she returned the drawer and turned toward the window again, a thought took root. Not a memory, but a tug. A thread, again, gentle, persistent. Jessica Fletcher was not a woman who chased shadows, but she did follow threads. "That sounds like a stretch, Jess," Seth Hazlitt said, setting down his coffee with a familiar grunt. "A funeral invitation goes to the wrong person and you think it's a cry for help." "I didn't say cry," Jessica replied evenly. "But you know as well as I do, some messages aren't sent by accident." He narrowed his eyes. "And some are. Come on, Jess. You get invitations and letters from all over. You're a famous author. Mistakes happen." She smiled softly. "True. But I've never been personally invited to mourn a stranger." Seth sighed. "Let me guess, now you're thinking of taking the train down there." "I haven't decided." "You just did," he muttered, sipping again. "You always get that look. That quiet, curious tilt in your eye. Like a bird who hears a note she can't quite place." Jessica chuckled. "I think you just called me a finch. A nosy finch," he grumbled. She reached for her coat. "Well, someone ought to be." That evening, Jessica sat alone in the living room, the fire low and the house silent, except for the occasional creak of the floor settling into night. The invitation lay on the table beside her, now creased slightly from handling. Her cup of tea had gone cold again. She'd read over the obituary online, sparse details, survived by 2 children, Clare and Henry. No mention of grandchildren, no charitable donations suggested, no cause of death stated, only a private family woman, known for her quiet grace and sharp intellect. She reached for her notepad, flipped to a clean page, and underlined a single word, Bellwood. Then quietly, almost as if she were afraid someone might overhear the decision, she took her phone and booked a one-way ticket. She would leave in the morning. The train pulled out of Cabot Cove just after dawn. Jessica watched the town recede behind her in the cold reflection of the window. She hadn't told anyone besides Seth she was leaving, not because it was secret, but because it was uncertain. The landscape blurred into muted colors, ochres, rust, soft brown fields resting before the snow. Towns passed by with names she didn't know and would not remember. She read for a while, then stopped. The pages meant little today. Somewhere ahead, in a town whose streets she'd never walked, a woman she'd never met had died, and someone, intentionally or not, had called her to witness it. Jessica folded the letter once more and slid it into her bag. She wasn't sure what she was seeking, only that something there was unfinished. Jessica stepped off the train just past noon, her coat collar turned up against the biting wind that rolled down from the hills. Bellwood was smaller than she'd imagined. One main street, a scattering of Victorian rooftops, and a modest town square edged in rusting iron benches. The station was nearly empty. A man with a newsboy cap tipped his head politely as she passed, and an older woman glanced up from her knitting without smiling. There was no welcome, no hostility, only a strange hush, as if the town had fallen into a habit of silence and now couldn't find its way out. Jessica paused by the station's bulletin board, where an old playbill fluttered alongside church announcements and an outdated yard sale flyer. A black ribbon had been pinned beside the Cargill funeral notice, but no one had bothered to straighten it. She folded the collar of her coat tighter and made her way toward the chapel. already feeling that peculiar tug behind her ribs. St. Agnes Chapel sat near the edge of the woods, half swallowed by ivy and shadow. Inside, the pews were only 2/3 full. The mourners sat in orderly rows, their clothes appropriate, their expressions carefully arranged. Jessica slipped into a seat near the back. The organ played a soft hymn, one of those minor key melodies that lingered in the walls long after the notes stopped. At the front, the closed casket rested beneath an enormous wreath of white lilies. No one cried, not even the family. The eulogy, delivered by a minister whose voice carried no warmth, was brief and curiously vague. Miriam Cargill was a woman of strong convictions, a woman who valued discipline, tradition, and discretion. Jessica's eyes moved across the faces in the front row. Clare Cargill sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed ahead. Beside her, Henry wore a dark overcoat and the faint smile of someone enduring obligation. When the final blessing was offered, no one lingered, no hugs, no murmured memories, just the scuff of polished shoes retreating toward the door. It was the most formal grief Jessica had ever witnessed. Outside the chapel, the wind stirred the hem of Jessica's coat as she approached the small gathering. A few townspeople stood in knots, whispering behind gloved hands. Mrs. Fletcher, a voice called gently. It was Clare, pale, composed, her hair drawn back in a modest twist. She extended her hand with a quiet grace that felt more practiced than sincere. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure if the invitation reached you." Jessica nodded. "It did, though I suspect it wasn't meant for me." Clare's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Henry Cargill joined them a moment later. He was taller than his sister, with a politician's easy posture, and eyes that never quite settled. "Ah yes, the mystery guest," he said lightly, taking Jessica's hand. "Our mother did love surprises." There was a hint of charm in his tone, but it didn't reach his eyes. Clare turned slightly away, her fingers tightening on the clasp of her handbag. Jessica noticed the silence between them, not hostility, exactly, but the unmistakable weight of things unsaid. A family, Jessica thought, accustomed to speaking through omission. The reception was held in the parish hall, a square room with teacups, cucumber sandwiches, and conversation as brittle as the china. Jessica moved quietly among the guests. Listening, names surfaced. Mr. and Mrs. Powell, who'd once rented land from the Cargills. Reverend Hughes, whose voice remained curiously absent during the service, and a Mrs. Dalloway, who leaned in close as Jessica passed and whispered, "She ruled that house like a queen but never earned the love of her court." Jessica turned slightly. "Pardon me." Mrs. Dalloway blinked, then smiled too sweetly. "Just a figure of speech." From the far end of the room someone else murmured, "Clare was the quiet one, always was," and another, "He only came back when the will was mentioned." Jessica caught every word, filed each voice away. They spoke of Miriam Cargill with respect, but never affection, as if mourning her were a duty, not a loss. She glanced back toward the siblings, standing apart in the corner, their silence now more telling than anything the guests had said aloud. The parish door creaked open with a gust of cold air. Heads turned. A woman in her early 60s stepped in hesitantly. Her coat was plain, her shoes worn. She carried no purse, only a small envelope clutched tightly in one gloved hand. Jessica saw the shift ripple through the room, not outrage but discomfort, quiet stiffness. Clare's eyes widened, and Henry stepped forward with forced cordiality. "I'm afraid this is a private gathering," he said, his tone still clipped at the edges. The woman's face flushed. "I only wanted to pay my respects. I was with your mother during the spring." Just before, Henry's jaw tightened. That arrangement ended as I recall. You were compensated. Clare lowered her eyes. Jessica watched closely. No one introduced the woman. No one asked her name. After a moment of unbearable silence, the woman gave a small nod, turned and left, the envelope still in her hand, unopened. Jessica followed her with her gaze. Whatever story she carried, it had been turned away before it was allowed to begin. As the reception thinned and chairs were quietly stacked, Clare approached Jessica once more. Her voice was soft, but her posture had changed. Something resigned had settled in her shoulders. "You've come all this way," she said. Would you consider staying the night? The house is quiet now, and I think," she paused, searching Jessica's face, "I think you might understand it." Jessica blinked. "That's very kind, but—" "Please," Clare interrupted. "There's room, and no one left to fill it." Henry turned toward them, overhearing. "Are we taking in house guests now?" he asked with a faint edge of humor. Mother would have adored the scandal. Clare didn't answer. The housekeeper, standing behind Henry with a tea tray, flinched almost imperceptibly at the remark. Jessica considered a moment, then nodded. "If you're sure, I'd be glad to." Clare gave a weary smile. "Then I'll have Eleanor prepare a room." There was something in her tone that felt less like hospitality, and more like confession waiting for the right listener. The Cargill estate rose behind a line of tall hedges, its windows shuttered against the wind. Jessica stepped out of the car, and took in the ivy-covered facade, the stone path edged in yellowing grass, the fountain long since dry. Clare led the way inside. The housekeeper, Eleanor, offered a stiff nod, and took Jessica's coat with eyes lowered. Inside, the silence pressed in like velvet. The hall smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. Portraits lined the staircase, stern faces with watchful eyes. A grandfather clock stood still at 4:15. "We haven't touched much," Clare said quietly. "It feels strange, somehow." Jessica nodded. She understood. Grief had a way of freezing time, but something here felt different. Older, inherited. Clare showed her to a guest room upstairs. The door creaked when it opened. "Will this be comfortable?" Jessica smiled gently. "Very." And yet, as she looked down the hallway of closed doors, she felt the familiar shift of instinct. Something here had waited too long to be seen. The car turned up the gravel drive, the wheels crunching softly beneath the bare branches overhead. Jessica sat in the back seat, watching the Cargill estate come into view, a brooding, three-gabled house wrapped in climbing ivy, and the kind of silence that felt cultivated. The iron gate creaked as it swung closed behind them. As they pulled to a stop, she stepped out and glanced around the grounds. A garden untended, a fountain choked with leaves, and shutters closed against the daylight. Clare exited first, her heels barely sounding against the stone. "It's always quieter in November," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Jessica followed slowly, the chill pressing in. Something about the stillness felt deliberate, not abandoned, but preserved, as though someone had taken care to keep things from changing. Inside, the air was faintly perfumed with wax and lavender. Jessica paused in the front hall, her gaze rising toward the second floor. The house didn't feel empty, it felt paused, like a play waiting for its final act. Clare left Jessica to settle in, promising tea in the parlor shortly. Alone, Jessica wandered the front hall, drawn toward a side corridor where light from a tall, narrow window spilled faintly across the floorboards. The sitting room door stood half open. Jessica eased it further and stepped inside. The furniture was impeccable, not new, but lovingly kept. A faint sheen of dust along the mantel suggested no one had touched it in days, perhaps weeks. An embroidered cushion sat perfectly centered on the armchair. The newspaper on the end table was folded to a crossword puzzle half filled in blue ink. Jessica's eyes found the grandfather clock tucked in the corner. Its pendulum was still. She checked her watch, 3:45. The clock read 11:22. In the hallway, another clock above a console table read 2:03. Odd, she thought. Not one had been set or maintained. She moved toward the staircase, her fingers grazing the polished banister. It wasn't just time that had stopped here, it was purpose. At the top of the stairs, a voice greeted her. "You'll be in the East Room. I've laid out towels." Jessica turned. A woman in her late 60s stood at the landing, a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair wound tightly at the back of her neck. "Thank you," Jessica said. "You must be Eleanor." The woman gave a short nod. "Miss Clare asked that I see." Jessica smiled, but Eleanor didn't return it. Instead, her eyes flicked down the hall, and then back again, never quite meeting Jessica's gaze. "Has the house been very quiet since Mrs. Cargill passed?" Eleanor's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Miss Miriam kept order in her home, even when she was ill. "There's no one to make noise now." The answer was neat, tiddy, but the stiffness in her voice suggested a deeper current. As she turned to leave, Jessica noticed the housekeeper's hand tremble ever so slightly, not from age, but something more brittle. Fear, perhaps, or restraint pressed too long into habit. Later that afternoon, Clare invited Jessica to tea in the sunroom, though the sun never quite touched the floor. They sat with a pot of Darjeeling and slices of lemon cake, untouched between them. "My mother was exacting," Clare said quietly, folding her hands over her lap. "She liked symmetry, stillness," she said. Too much motion gave the house a nervous energy. Jessica nodded gently. "And did you live here all your life, except for college?" "But even then I came home every summer. I suppose I never left for long." She paused, looking toward the garden. The hedges had grown wild in places. "She wasn't cruel," Clare added suddenly. "Not in the way people assume, but she didn't leave room for other people's feelings." Jessica waited a beat before replying. "I imagine that made grief difficult." Clare's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled tighter around the teacup. "You can't grieve what never let you close." The clock in the hallway ticked once and stopped. Jessica leaned back. The pain in Clare's voice wasn't loud, but it was honest, and honesty, in this house, felt like a rare and precious intrusion. The library smelled of tobacco and old wood polish, lined with books whose pages had likely never been turned. Jessica found Henry near the window, sipping brandy with studied elegance. "Aunt Jessica," he said, adopting the tone of a man who'd used charm as armor for most of his life. "Or may I call you Jessica?" She smiled. "Either is fine. I trust Clare hasn't overwhelmed you with family lore." "She's always had a fondness for melancholia. She's been very gracious," Jessica replied. "It's a beautiful home." "Ah yes, beautiful and burdened," he said, swirling the glass. "Our mother had exacting standards, for decor, for behavior, for bloodlines." Jessica tilted her head. "And you returned after how long away?" He smiled. "Long enough to forget, short enough to still matter. Families are like old estates. They require maintenance." There was something hollow behind his affability. She watched his fingers, well kept, but drumming ever so slightly on the windowsill. Nervous energy, despite the polish. "You're not planning to stay long, I imagine?" he asked. Jessica smiled softly. "That depends on what I find." Jessica found Robert Winslow in the drawing room, hunched over a leather folder, glasses slipping to the edge of his nose. He looked up, startled, then smoothed his tie. "Ah, Mrs. Fletcher. I trust you're being well looked after. Very much so, thank you. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, just making sense of the last set of directives Miss Cargill left behind. Jessica approached slowly. I imagine the will was rather complex. Winslow gave a tight smile. Not complex, just thorough. She was, as you might expect, very particular. She noticed he did not offer to show the documents, and the revisions. Were they recent? Some minor adjustments, he said quickly, but nothing unexpected. He tucked a sheet further into the folder, almost too deliberately. Jessica nodded. Families often find surprises where they least expect them. Winslow laughed too short. Indeed, as Jessica left the room, she noted the date printed faintly on the open document, October 12th, 3 days before Miriam's death. And yet no one had mentioned any recent legal changes. Jessica's room was comfortably appointed, a writing desk, a high-backed chair, and thick curtains that dulled the wind outside. But sleep did not come easily. She rose near midnight, wrapping her robe tightly, and padded into the hall. The house was dark save for the faintest glimmer of moonlight through the stained glass above the stairs, and quiet, oppressively so. She walked past the study, past the clocks she had seen earlier. None ticked, but as she reached the far end of the corridor she paused. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, tick, 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 drifted from behind the walls. She stepped closer. It stopped. There were no clocks in this part of the house. Jessica stood still, listening. Nothing. But the air had changed, not in temperature, but in tension. She returned to her room and lay awake for hours, one thought looping gently through her mind. If time had stopped here, why was something now starting again? The next morning brought pale sunlight filtering through the frost-glazed windows. Jessica rose early, drawn by the quiet hum of thought that had kept her awake well past midnight. The study at the rear of the house had not changed since the funeral. She entered gently, half expecting to find someone already seated at the desk. But the room was still, and held the weight of long silence. Rows of books lined the walnut shelves, their leather bindings cracked and faded. Some had gold lettering worn smooth with age. Jessica passed a hand along the spines, breathing in the scent of paper, wax, and faint lavender, the same fragrance she had detected in the hallway, threaded into the air like memory. There were titles on English history, French poetry, a full set of encyclopedias, and a surprising number of books on pharmacology and herbal medicine. Near the window stood a small reading table stacked with devotional texts and weathered journals. Jessica paused. The arrangement didn't look accidental, but something was just slightly off, a quiet nudge in the architecture of order. She began to tidy and investigate. The family Bible lay beneath a pile of small religious books, slightly askew, its spine bent open toward the back. Jessica gently lifted it. The cover was scuffed but well kept, the gold leaf of Holy Bible still faintly gleaming in the light. It opened easily to the Psalms, near the final pages, as though it had been visited often. But the way the binding gave, soft in the hands, almost worn, made her pause. Someone had lingered here, often, and not for ceremony. A small indentation along the inner fold of the page caught her eye. Carefully, she ran her fingertip along it, and felt the edge of something folded, something thin, hidden deep within the binding crease. She tilted the Bible toward the light. There, barely visible, was the tip of a yellowed page, older than the rest, slipped between chapters not for safekeeping, but concealment. Jessica drew it out with practiced care, unfolding it slowly. It was a letter, or rather the start of one, in a narrow, hurried hand, unsigned, unsent, but unmistakably personal. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, Not from her grip, but from age, as though it had absorbed the tension of the writer and kept it there, brittle and dry. The first line was written in looping script. To whomever finds this, please understand, I can't trust anyone, not even those closest to me. Jessica sat at the desk and smoothed the page carefully. The letter was brief, fragmented, as if written in haste or fear. There were no greetings, no formal opening, just a stream of thoughts, broken by dashes and uneven spacing. I think someone has been altering my medication. I asked Eleanor to check, but she said everything was fine. I don't think she's telling me the truth. Claire has been distant. I can't ask her without frightening her. I've hidden the key. I had to. It's not safe anymore. No mention of what the key opened. No name of the person she feared. But the ink faded in the last line, the final words trailing off mid-sentence. If something happens to me. Jessica sat back slowly. This was no journal entry, no private musing. It was a warning never sent, a plea that never reached its listener. Jessica read the letter again, this time more slowly. The language was scattered, but deliberate, laced with tension and the quiet panic of a woman who felt watched in her own home. What struck her most was the absence of anger. Miriam hadn't seemed vindictive or paranoid in her tone, just weary, mistrustful, isolated. The line about altered medication tugged sharply at Jessica's attention. She recalled the discussion in the drawing room, the will, the careful omission of details. Robert Winslow had seemed composed, yes, but evasive. And Henry's affability had carried a whiff of calculation. Had someone truly tampered with Miriam's prescriptions? And what of the key? I've hidden the key. It's not safe anymore. To what? A drawer? A safe? A box in the garden? The house had more locked cabinets than she could count. And the most disturbing line, the one Jessica couldn't forget, wasn't even a sentence. If something happens to me, it was the dash that chilled her. The suggestion that something had interrupted her, or that she had no more time to finish. Jessica looked out the window, toward the mist-frosted trees. Something had happened to Miriam Cargill, and it hadn't been natural. Later that morning, Jessica found Eleanor in the linen room, folding sheets with mechanical precision. I came across a letter, Jessica began gently, tucked inside the family Bible. The housekeeper froze, one hand still pressed flat against the fabric. A letter? It seemed to be written by Mrs. Cargill. She mentioned fears about her medication, that she didn't feel safe. Eleanor's face didn't change, but the fold she made next was uneven. She was confused. Toward the end, she said briskly, worried over nothing. Sometimes she forgot what she had taken. Sometimes she took it twice. That's possible, Jessica said softly. But she mentioned a key, that she hid it. She had many keys, Eleanor replied, returning to the sheet. To rooms, cabinets, safes she hadn't opened in years. Perhaps she misplaced one. Jessica watched her closely. The housekeeper's voice remained calm, but her hands were moving faster now, too fast, pressing folds into corners already smoothed. There was something Eleanor wasn't saying, or someone she wasn't protecting. In the late afternoon, Jessica found Clare in the drawing room, seated near the unlit fireplace with a book closed in her lap. I wanted to ask you about something I found, Jessica said. Clare looked up, her expression unreadable. Jessica held out the letter. It was in the Bible. Clare took it with both hands. As she read, her shoulders grew still, and her lips parted slightly, not in shock, but recognition. When she finished, she folded the page twice, carefully, and returned it to Jessica. She was always writing things, Clare said quietly. Journals, notes, instructions. Some made sense, others, less so. But this wasn't a journal, Clare. It reads like a warning. Clare didn't answer immediately. She stood and walked toward the window. Toward the end she didn't trust anyone, not even me. Every creak in the floorboard, every unopened drawer, it fed into something. Jessica rose. You believe she was paranoid? Clare turned. Her eyes were dry, but her voice softened. I believe she was dramatic, always was, even with death. But Jessica caught the faintest tremble in her hand as she reached for the drapes, and that tremble said more than her words ever could. That evening, long after the hall lights had dimmed, Jessica sat at the desk in her guest room, the letter once more unfolded in her hands. She read it again, not for new information, but for tone, for the rhythm of fear between the lines. Miriam hadn't been ranting. Her words were too measured, her thoughts too specific. She had suspected someone of tampering with her medicine. She had mentioned Eleanor, distanced Clare, and hidden a key. Jessica let her eyes rest on the phrase, "Not even those closest to me." The phrase spoke of betrayal not just suspected, but anticipated. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling Miriam's face from the photograph in the hallway. A strong face, eyes sharp even in age, not easily frightened, not easily confused. Something had broken through that discipline, and now she was gone, not violently, not suddenly, but in the quiet way of things that are helped along, unseen. Jessica opened her notebook and wrote a single word, motive, then paused. She didn't yet know who had done it, but for the first time she believed someone had. A soft veil of fog still clung to the hedges when Jessica opened her window. The light was pale, the sky washed in silver. Somewhere, faint birdsong drifted through the damp air. She dressed quietly and stepped outside, drawn by the calm of morning and something less tangible, a sense that answers here did not live in ledgers or letters, but in the quiet corners of people's routines. In the distance, she spotted Clare walking alone along the stone garden path. Her coat hung loosely at the shoulders, and her pace was slow, almost meditative. Jessica joined her without calling out. Clare acknowledged her with a brief glance, then returned her gaze to the ground. Together they walked in silence for a few moments, their steps muffled by fallen leaves. The fog had begun to lift, and yet something in Clare's posture remained clouded, not simply with grief, but the weight of remembering. Jessica waited, knowing some truths required space to rise. As they passed the weathered gate, leading toward the orchard, Clare spoke, not with intent, but as if some invisible thread had tugged loose. "Mother used to prune the apple trees herself," she murmured, "even when she was ill. She said the dead branches reminded her that beauty needs culling." Jessica glanced sideways, but said nothing. Clare continued, eyes fixed ahead. "We weren't allowed to pick the fruit until September 10th, always that date." She believed early sweetness turned bitter. A small laugh escaped her, hollow without warmth. She had rules for everything. How many napkins at the table, which drawer we kept matches in, whether the piano was played before or after tea. Jessica's voice was gentle, that sounds structured. Clare's reply came more quickly than expected. It was control, Mrs. Fletcher. Structure, yes, but not for comfort, for containment. Jessica felt the heaviness behind those words, fragmented memories, sharp edges that didn't quite fit. "And your father?" she asked. "He learned to be absent," Clare said simply, "even while he was still alive." The orchard trees whispered in the breeze. Shadows dappled their path, not dark but restless. They came upon the old stone bench beneath a broad sycamore, its bark mottled with age, and its branches stretching protectively above them. Clare sat, brushing away a few dry leaves. Jessica remained standing, watching the woman's face carefully. "She used to sit here every Sunday," Clare said, "reading reports." Writing notes to the staff? Not letters, never letters. She preferred things that could be burned. Jessica tilted her head. You said yesterday that she trusted no one. Clare gave a small nod. That included herself. After a long pause, she added, Last spring she said she was going to change the will. Jessica's breath caught slightly. Did she tell you why? Clare hesitated, then shook her head. No, only that it was necessary, and that Henry wouldn't like it. She told you that? She told me. Enough. Clare looked down at her hands, but nothing came of it. She died before anything was filed, or so they say. Jessica sat beside her, letting the quiet settle. A will rewritten, but never revealed. A motive, perhaps, or only a memory that had waited too long to speak. Clare excused herself a few minutes later, needing, she said, to check on something in the kitchen. Jessica wandered further into the garden, her path winding past trimmed hedges and beds of browning lavender. By the garden shed, a man knelt beside a patch of soil, hands deep in the earth. Mr. Fallon, she called softly. The man looked up, wiping his palms on his trousers. He was in his 70s, lean and sun-weathered, with a face that had folded into kindly creases. George'll do, he said, standing. You're the writer guest. Jessica smiled, guilty as charged. He nodded toward the soil. Place doesn't grow like it used to. Something in the roots, or maybe something in the house. She raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. Things linger, Miss Anger. Secrets. You feel it, don't you? Jessica's voice was quiet. Did you work for the family long? 38 years, long enough to know when a storm's coming. He leaned on his shovel, the smile returning faintly. Mrs. Cargill didn't always listen, he added, but she always heard, and sometimes Jessica thought hearing was more dangerous than speaking. Jessica followed George as he carried a pail toward the greenhouse, the scent of damp soil and mint in the air. I hope you don't mind me asking, she said, but did you notice any change in Mrs. Cargill near the end? George paused, set the pail down. She got quieter. Not in the usual way, not the kind of quiet that means peace, the kind that means she was thinking too hard. Was she ill? She was tired. I think something weighed on her. He brushed a hand across a pane of glass, clearing the condensation. One afternoon, he added, I heard raised voices from the parlor, hers and Mr. Henry's. Rare thing that. She usually kept her temper folded neat. Jessica's attention sharpened. Do you remember what it was about? George nodded slowly. She told him, plain as day, I won't let you take what isn't earned. He stormed out, didn't come back for 2 weeks. Jessica's mind turned to the letter, the mention of the will, the hidden key. Something had been set in motion, but Miriam hadn't lived to see it through, and Henry perhaps had. Later that afternoon, Jessica found Clare in the conservatory, pruning back a dried vine with slow, deliberate movements. I spoke with George, Jessica said gently. Clare didn't look up. He mentioned hearing an argument between your brother and your mother, about the will. Clare's hand faltered, just slightly, the shears clipping through air before finding the stem again. George talks too much, she said quietly. Did she ever show you the revised document? Jessica asked. No. Did Henry know she planned to change it? Clare straightened. I don't know what Henry knew, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm not his keeper. There was a note of finality in her tone, but something deeper too, fatigue, or fear. I just want to understand what happened, Jessica said. Clare turned sharply. So do I. But understanding doesn't always bring peace. Without another word, she stepped past Jessica and left the room, the scent of withered roses lingering behind her. And once again Jessica found herself alone, in a house where every truth seemed half-spoken, and every silence sharpened like glass. Back in her room, Jessica sat at the small desk and opened her notebook. The day's conversations circled in her thoughts like dry leaves on wind. She wrote in neat lines. Miriam planned to revise will. Henry likely knew. Clare silent, protecting or hiding. Letter equal sign fear of medication tampering. Key equal sign still missing. She paused and underlined the last word. The key, a literal object, yes, but perhaps also metaphorical. What unlocked Miriam's fear, or sealed someone else's desperation? She stared out the window toward the garden, where the bench beneath the sycamore stood empty again. What had Miriam meant when she said someone wanted to take what wasn't earned? Inheritance? Control? A final act of punishment? She turned the page and wrote a single question. Would someone kill not out of anger, but inheritance? Then added below it, or worse, to erase guilt. She closed the notebook gently and set down her pen. Whatever Miriam had feared, it hadn't been imaginary. And Jessica was beginning to suspect it hadn't been sudden either. The next morning, Jessica returned to Miriam's bedroom, drawn not by curiosity, but by something quieter, instinct sharpened by unease. The room remained immaculate, the curtains half drawn against the morning light. Her eyes moved across the writing desk, then toward the corner where a tall walnut cabinet stood. It was narrow, with a mirrored front and brass hinges dulled by time. A small keyhole sat just beneath the handle, not unusual. What gave Jessica pause was the drawer just below, left slightly ajar, as though someone had closed it in haste. She pulled it open gently. Inside, resting atop a folded linen handkerchief, was a small brass key. She held it a moment, feeling its warmth from the room. Sliding the key into the lock, she turned it slowly. It gave with a soft click. Inside were shelves neatly arranged with prescription bottles, a worn stethoscope, and an embossed leather pouch marked Cargill and Ames Medical Supply. Not hidden, not sealed away. And yet, no one had mentioned this cabinet in the days since Miriam's passing. Jessica reached for the nearest label, already feeling the breath of something wrong. Jessica examined the contents with deliberate care. Most of the medications were familiar: mild blood pressure tablets, a low-dose aspirin, a vitamin supplement. All were dated from months earlier. But one bottle stood out. Its label was crisp, clean, newer than the rest. Lorazepam 2 milligrams, 1 capsule at bedtime. Jessica frowned. Lorazepam was a powerful sedative, strong enough to impair cognition in elderly patients, and typically avoided in cases of frailty or chronic respiratory issues. She recalled reading an article just last spring warning against its use in women over 70. Miriam had been 84. She checked the prescribing doctor. The name matched a Bellwood physician she hadn't heard mentioned in any conversation. The dosage, she noted, was high, unusually so, enough to cause dizziness, confusion, perhaps even heart complications if combined with other medications. Jessica checked the dispensing date. 2 weeks before Miriam's death. She counted the remaining capsules. Nearly all were gone. Her gaze returned to the cabinet's contents. Nothing else suggested misuse or disorder. Everything had been kept meticulously arranged, except the timing. Jessica held the bottle in her palm, and felt, for the first time, the edges of a silent violence. The air outside carried the damp bite of late autumn as Jessica made her way into Bellwood's small pharmacy, tucked between a hardware store and a florist. The bell above the door chimed softly. A young woman stood behind the counter, her name tag reading Emily. She looked up and offered a polite, if slightly cautious, smile. "Can I help you?" Jessica introduced herself gently and explained that she had a question regarding a prescription filled recently for Miriam Cargill. Emily's brows knit. "Yes, I remember, Mrs. Cargill hadn't had new prescriptions for a while. We used to deliver to the estate years ago. But that one," she turned to the computer, typing quickly. "Yes, Laura's Acor, filled 2 weeks before her passing, picked up by Eleanor, the housekeeper." Jessica nodded. "Did she say who prescribed it?" Emily scrolled. "Dr. Welby. But that's odd. We usually get longer scripts from him. This was just 10 capsules. Jessica leaned in slightly. "Short course, or a test dose," Emily offered. "But it was refilled, same prescription, same pickup." Jessica thanked her and stepped back out into the cold. Short courses rarely warranted 2 bottles, unless someone else had been taking them, or giving them. Back at the estate, Jessica found Eleanor arranging flowers in the foyer. The chrysanthemums looked freshly cut, their edges still damp from morning dew. "Eleanor," Jessica said gently, "did Miriam mention anything about a new prescription in her last weeks?" Eleanor didn't look up. She took her usual, "I laid it out every evening, as always." "Laura's Acor?" Jessica asked. The housekeeper's hands paused above the vase. "I don't recall that one. It was picked up in your name, twice." Now Eleanor met her gaze, steady but faintly clouded. "She asked for something to help her sleep," she said slowly. "Said the nights had grown long. I assumed the doctor approved it." Jessica tilted her head. "So she asked you directly?" Eleanor's mouth tightened. "She mentioned it. I only fetched what was needed." Jessica noted the shift. The phrasing had changed from clear routine to justification. "She trusted you," Jessica said softly. Eleanor straightened. "I served her well." Then she turned back to the flowers, placing a white bloom precisely at the center, as though order might conceal unease. That evening, after the house had settled into hush, Clare found Jessica in the parlor, seated near the unlit hearth. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the chair opposite. Jessica nodded, setting her book aside. Clare folded her hands in her lap. "I read your expression earlier. You found something." Jessica waited, then quietly said, "Your mother was taking a sedative, Laura's Acor. Did you know?" Clare blinked, then shook her head. "No, she never told me. She wasn't supposed to be on it," Jessica added. "It wasn't safe." Clare's voice dropped. She had been acting strange, in her last days, forgetful, suspicious. "She told me she thought Eleanor was watching her, that someone was moving things in her room." Jessica leaned forward slightly. "And you believed it was paranoia?" "I didn't know what to believe," Clare whispered. "I thought maybe she was fading." Jessica said nothing, but the image returned, a letter hidden in a Bible, a woman terrified of her own medicine. Clare's eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "I didn't see it," she said, "or I didn't want to." And perhaps, Jessica thought, that had made all the difference. Their silence was broken by the sudden scrape of the door behind them. Henry entered without apology, his coat still damp with evening mist, and the scent of bourbon faint on his breath. "Well, this looks cozy," he remarked, his voice sharp with irony. Jessica rose slowly. "We were discussing your mother's medication." Henry's smile faltered. "And you thought that was your business?" Clare stood, her voice strained. "Henry, no really," he interrupted. Eyes locked on Jessica. "You've been snooping through drawers, questioning the staff, implying all sorts of things with those clever silences of yours. But let me make something clear. This isn't a story, Mrs. Fletcher. This is family." Jessica's tone remained calm. "Sometimes the two aren't so different." Henry stepped closer. "If you're looking for villains, try fiction. Leave this place be." He turned and walked out, the echo of his shoes retreating into the hallway. Clare sat down again, suddenly older in her seat. Jessica remained standing, the taste of the moment bitter in her throat. He had spoken like a man afraid of where the story might lead. Alone once more, Jessica returned to her room and laid the medicine bottles on the desk, arranging them in a careful row. Labels forward, dosages exposed. Lorazepam at the center. She took a long breath and sat down, her pen poised above the open page of her notebook. She didn't write. Instead, she stared at the label, the numbers, the doctor's name, the quiet implication. 1 capsule a night, 10 capsules per bottle, 2 bottles dispensed. Miriam had died on the 12th day. Jessica read the warning label aloud in a whisper. May cause confusion, slowed breathing, dizziness, loss of consciousness. And if taken in double measure, she glanced back at the notes she had made days earlier. Letter, will, key, guilt. Now, a new word emerged, not scribbled, but spoken into the hush of the room. Assisted. She reached out, gently touching the last bottle. Someone helped her die, she whispered. Not rage, not revenge, not gain, but perhaps something quieter, more intimate. The kind of motive that wore the face of care and the hands of quiet harm. The invitation came late in the afternoon, delivered not with warmth, but with ceremony. "Dinner at 7, Henry said, appearing in the doorway of the library where Jessica had been reading. "We thought it best to sit down as a family, share a meal, move forward." His smile was carefully shaped, his posture open, but Jessica noted the edge beneath it, the faint stiffness around the eyes. "I'd be glad to join," she replied, marking her page. When she arrived in the dining room, the table was already set, polished silver, monogrammed linen, crystal glasses that hadn't seen use in months. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the mahogany. Clare sat near the far end, her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the place setting before her. Eleanor moved between the sideboard and table, with the quiet precision of habit, offering no commentary, no glance toward anyone. Jessica took her seat beside the lawyer, Robert Winslow, who adjusted his cuffs as if the evening required a courtly defense. The air, though scented with rosemary and wine, already tasted of tension. Robert Winslow, seated at the midpoint between the siblings, assumed a curious prominence as the meal began. He asked Clare about the garden, then Henry about the cellar renovations, not truly listening, but carefully balancing the conversation like a man tiptoeing across fragile ice. Jessica watched him quietly. His voice was steady, his tone amiable, but his eyes kept darting toward Henry, small unspoken checks, as though awaiting cues. Henry, for his part, responded with the easy charm of a man hosting a dinner party he neither enjoyed nor trusted. "It's good to have everyone at the same table again," he said, lifting his glass in a meaningless gesture. "Mother would have insisted on it." Clare gave no reply. Jessica leaned slightly toward Winslow. It must be a relief to have the estate matters nearing completion. He coughed lightly and took a sip of water. "Yes, of course, though there are always lingering details." Jessica offered a pleasant smile, but her mind sharpened. Details, yes, and the man named to handle them was behaving like someone afraid of stepping in the wrong direction. The first course arrived, a delicately prepared squash soup, but Clare made no move toward her spoon. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers laced tightly together. The room buzzed with forced conversation until Henry, in a tone of feigned casualness, said, "Robert tells me the distribution of assets is progressing well. I imagine we'll have everything finalized by month's end." Clare looked up. Her voice was calm, but it cut cleanly through the room. "Unless the will changed." Henry stilled. "Pardon?" I said, Clare repeated, more clearly, unless Mother changed her will, which she intended to. Jessica saw Winslow shift uncomfortably in his seat. Henry's smile remained, but the edges frayed. Clare, we've been through this. There was no revised document, no filed revision, she corrected. But she spoke of it. She told me. She told you many things, Henry replied, especially when her mind was slipping. Clare flinched. Jessica watched the moment closely, the veiled accusation, the calculated dismissiveness, the way Robert lowered his gaze as though distancing himself from what had just passed. Clare's glass remained untouched, the wine within still and dark. Something in that silence was louder than any word. Dessert was served, a spiced pear tart, delicate and fragrant, but no one reached for it. I think we all need to accept the past as it is, Henry said, his fork resting untouched. Mother is gone. The house is ours now. Let's not tarnish her memory with insinuation. Insinuation? Clare echoed, her voice tight. You mean truth? Eleanor approached with the coffee tray, her movements just slightly unsteady now. She wasn't confused, Clare continued. She was scared, and you knew it. Henry's smile faltered. That's enough, Clare. Jessica noticed Eleanor's hands trembling as she poured the coffee, not from age, but from the weight of the words unraveling around her. She told me she was afraid of you, Clare said, her voice rising only slightly. Stop, Henry hissed, the charm now stripped clean. Silence fell as Eleanor withdrew the tray, her eyes wide, her steps uneven. The tart remained untouched. The heat in the room, once hidden beneath civility, now pulsed through every corner, a fire long denied, now flickering into light. Jessica remained silent through the storm, her gaze traveling from Clare's clenched fists to Henry's narrowed eyes, and finally to Robert Winslow, who had grown pale beneath the collar of his shirt. It was his face, not Henry's, that drew her attention now. At Clare's mention of the revised will, Winslow had flinched, a subtle recoil, almost imperceptible, but not missed, and then his hand had moved, not to his fork, nor his glass, but to the pocket of his coat, where Jessica guessed lay something he had not yet disclosed. She let the conversation drift back to silence, knowing it would not stay there long. Henry reached for his napkin, but his hand paused mid-air. Clare stared at her brother with the calm of someone who had stopped hoping for apology. Jessica's thoughts circled slowly. There were truths being revealed in posture and pause, fear disguised as fatigue, control slipping beneath the weight of inheritance, and somewhere in Robert Winslow's rigid form sat the confirmation of a change Miriam had intended and someone had buried. Henry cleared his throat, sat straighter, and reached for his wine glass. I think we can all agree, he said, voice polished once more, that tonight marks a turning point. The worst is behind us. A new chapter begins. He raised the glass toward the center of the table. To peace, he said, and to family. Clare didn't move. Her hands were back in her lap. Jessica observed the pause, the beat of stillness that followed, hollow and unmistakable. Robert Winslow stared at the glass in front of him as though it belonged to someone else. Eleanor remained near the doorway, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Henry waited. No one raised a glass. The silence was not loud, it was final. He lowered the glass slowly, the stem clicking softly against his plate. Jessica looked around the table and saw not grief, not reconciliation, but resignation, a collective recognition that something had broken long before Miriam's passing, and now even the pretense of unity had fractured. The candles had burned low, the room now shadowed at its edges. Clare stood slowly, pushing her chair back with careful precision. She didn't look at anyone as she spoke. Nothing about her death was peaceful, she said softly. Not for her, not for me, not for any of us. Her voice cracked slightly, not from anger, but exhaustion. Jessica remained still. Clare turned to Henry. You may have the house, the paintings, the pearl. Take them all, but don't ask me to sit here and pretend any of it meant love. Henry opened his mouth, but no sound came. Clare looked to Eleanor next, her eyes gentler now. She needed more than care. She needed honesty, and none of us gave it to her. She walked toward the door, pausing only once, her voice lower. She was afraid, and none of you noticed. Then she was gone, her steps echoing down the hall, like the slow ticking of a long-forgotten clock. Jessica rose, the tension still tight in the room, her thoughts settling into place like pieces waiting for the final. The house had long since gone still. Only the creak of old wood and the ticking of Jessica's bedside clock filled the silence when the soft knock came, hesitant, almost uncertain it deserved to be heard. Jessica rose and opened the door gently. Clare stood there in her robe, hair unpinned, her face pale and drawn but oddly resolute. She held nothing in her hands, but something in her posture. The way her shoulders tilted slightly forward suggested a burden carried too long. May I come in? She asked quietly. Jessica stepped aside without a word. They sat in silence for a long moment, the lamplight low, the night stretching thin between them. I've been trying to sleep, Clare said at last, but something won't let me. Jessica nodded gently, watching her with quiet understanding. I think you already know, Clare continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica didn't answer, not yet. Some truths she had learned only revealed themselves when given space to breathe. They moved to the parlor, where Jessica coaxed a few embers to life in the hearth. The fire sputtered softly, offering more light than warmth. Clare sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if to anchor herself. She started seeing things, she began. Little things. She'd accuse Eleanor of stealing, of moving her things. Said Henry was standing outside her door at night, even when he wasn't here. Jessica listened, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She wasn't wrong. Not entirely, Clare added. People were watching her, but it wasn't conspiracy. It was caution. She was forgetting words, leaving the stove on, hiding her pills. Her voice broke slightly, but she never admitted anything was wrong. She said everyone else was the problem. Clare leaned forward, elbows on her knees. She became someone I didn't recognize, sharp, afraid, manipulative. I stopped knowing how to help her. Jessica waited. The wait in the room wasn't grief exactly, but the kind that came after too much of it, a sorrow that had outlived explanation. Clare stared into the fire as she spoke, the words falling like ash. It was raining, she said. I remember because the power had flickered. The house was dark except for the hallway lamp. I went in to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, fully dressed, staring at nothing. Jessica remained still, listening without interrupting. She asked me if I had moved the bottle. I said no, but I had. I'd hidden it earlier, because I thought she was taking too much. Clare swallowed hard. She got angry. Not loud, but disappointed, like I'd broken a rule. She told me it was hers, that I had no right. She found it eventually. I watched her take 2 capsules. I knew it was too much. I stood there, and I said nothing. Jessica's breath caught, not in judgment, but in recognition of the weight behind silence. I thought maybe it would help her sleep, or maybe part of me. Clare didn't finish. She was still breathing when I left the room. When I came back in the morning, she wasn't. The fire popped softly. I didn't kill her, Clare whispered. but I didn't stop it either. Jessica waited, offering no comfort that would cheapen the moment. Clare rubbed her palms together, as though trying to warm a truth gone cold. It wasn't revenge, she said quietly, and it wasn't neglect. I wasn't trying to punish her, I just couldn't watch anymore. Jessica's eyes held steady. She was so afraid, Jessica, afraid of being left alone, afraid of what people would say if they knew her mind was slipping, afraid of Henry, afraid of me. She wouldn't let anyone in, and by the time she tried, it was already too late. Clare's voice thickened. The doctors would have sedated her anyway, put her somewhere she would have hated. I thought maybe it would be easier, softer. She looked up. Is that monstrous? Is that mercy? Jessica exhaled softly, her voice like linen drawn through the air. It's complicated. Clare nodded. That's the part no one says out loud, that love in the end doesn't always look like protection. She turned back to the fire. Sometimes it looks like leaving the room, sometimes it looks like staying silent, and sometimes, Jessica thought, it looks exactly like this, a woman naming what can't be undone. Jessica shifted slightly, her tone even, but edged with care. Did you tell Eleanor? Clare shook her head. No, she would have blamed herself. She always believed in Mother's strength, even when it became cruelty. And Henry, a pause. He suspected something. He's not foolish, just self-absorbed. He knew something wasn't right, but he was too busy hoping for the inheritance to ask the right questions. Jessica leaned in gently. And the doctor, did he ever question the prescription? Clare shook her head again. It was all through Eleanor. She handled the pickups. I only found the second bottle after. Jessica reached out and touched her hand lightly. Why now? Clare looked up. Because you listened. And because I need someone to know the truth, even if no one ever says it out loud. Jessica gave a faint nod. The room, still lit only by the fire's low glow, felt not warmer, but more honest. And in that honesty, something fragile began to take shape. Not forgiveness, but the possibility of it. Clare leaned back in the chair, her gaze drifting toward the darkened windows. I don't expect anything to come of this, she said. No courtroom, no confession. There's no one left to punish, except me. Jessica's voice was quiet. Do you believe you deserve punishment? Clare's reply was almost inaudible. Sometimes, but not always. A long pause. No, she whispered, not always. She stood and walked toward the mantel, touching a photograph that rested near the clock. It showed Miriam much younger, standing in the garden, stern-faced, dignified. She never wanted to be seen as weak. Even in the end, I think she believed dignity meant silence. Jessica rose but said nothing. Clare turned. I don't need anyone's forgiveness. I just needed someone to see what it cost. Jessica looked into her face, lined now not with age, but with the weight of love unspoken. You're not alone, she said simply. And for the first time Clare seemed to believe her. Jessica returned to her room just after 2, the embers in the parlor fading to a soft red glow. She didn't write in her journal. She didn't draft a letter or make a list of clues. Some truths she knew did not belong to her, only to those who carried them. In the hallway, Clare had paused before her own door. I don't want this to become public, she'd said. It won't, Jessica promised. But I hope it won't stay hidden from you. Clare had given a tired smile. That's the harder part. Now, in the hush of the upstairs corridor, Jessica stared out the window into the blackened garden. Somewhere beyond the trees, the bench beneath the sycamore stood in shadow. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else. No justice, only truth. Then closed the curtains and turned away. Whatever peace lay ahead, It would not come through judgment, but perhaps in time it might come through healing. The dining room felt less like a room and more like a memory, faded at the edges, heavy with what was never said. Jessica sat at the long oak table, her hands wrapped around a teacup that had long since gone lukewarm. Across from her, Clare stirred her oatmeal without eating, eyes fixed on the far wall, where a painting of the estate in springtime hung, vivid, misplaced in this grey hour. Eleanor moved with practiced quiet, laying out toast and jam, her expression unreadable. She did not ask if anyone needed more tea. Jessica offered a soft thank you, but the housekeeper only nodded, as if speaking would unravel something too fragile. The silence wasn't tense. It was something deeper, a fatigue perhaps, or the first breath after too many held in. Clare looked up once, just briefly, and met Jessica's gaze. No words passed between them, but in that moment something shifted, an unspoken acknowledgement that truth had taken its toll, and the cost had been paid not in revelations but in silence. When the meal ended, no chairs scraped, no silver clinked. Each woman stood at her own pace, as though they were walking away from a shared vigil rather than a breakfast. The hallway smelled faintly of cigar smoke, though no one had smoked indoors since Miriam's death. Jessica passed by the study and noticed a half-empty tumbler left on the sideboard, a final gesture from someone who never intended to return. Eleanor, dusting the stair rail, paused when Jessica asked, "Has Henry gone?" "He left before sunrise," the housekeeper said. "Didn't say much, just packed a bag and called for a cab." She hesitated, then added, "Didn't look back either." Jessica nodded, unsurprised. The night before had unraveled what diplomacy never could. Henry's charm had thinned to something brittle, and now he was gone, not in disgrace, not in victory, but in quiet retreat. The inheritance, like everything else, remained unresolved. Clare had not mentioned his departure, nor had she asked about the estate, or the will, or the lawyer who had vanished shortly after dessert. Some silences were protective, others were indictments. Jessica stepped into the front parlor, where the clock still stood unwound. Rain gathered in the morning sky beyond the windows. It would come, whether invited or not, like truth or consequence. The garden path curled behind the estate, like a forgotten lullaby. Jessica walked slowly, her coat buttoned high against the breeze, her steps muffled on damp earth. The air smelled of soil and faded roses, and the first crisp leaves had begun to fall from the sycamores. Here, nature held no opinion of the affairs inside. It simply moved forward, shedding, sleeping, blooming again. Jessica paused by the weathered bench beneath the largest tree, its arms speckled with lichen. She thought of Clare sitting here just days ago, hands folded, gaze cast inward. Further down the path, the old greenhouse stood half-shuttered, its panes clouded with moss. Jessica approached and peered in. Inside, a few stubborn plants stretched toward the light, their roots tangled but surviving. Another kind of legacy perhaps, quiet, persistent. A robin startled from the hedge as she turned back toward the house. Behind her, footprints trailed through the dew, temporary, like guilt, like grief. By the time she reached the stone steps, the clouds had thickened. A single drop landed on her sleeve. The garden had offered no answers, only perspective. Sometimes that was enough. Back inside, the hush of the house pressed in again, but something had shifted. Jessica stood in the foyer and tilted her head. There it was, a faint, rhythmic tick, barely audible beneath the creak of old beams and the distant rustle of rain. She turned toward the grandfather clock near the front door. Its brass pendulum moved slowly, faithfully, alive again. Eleanor emerged from the hallway, a soft chamois cloth still in her hands. She didn't offer an explanation, nor did Jessica ask for one. But the housekeeper's face held something that resembled peace, or perhaps just closure. "You wound them all?" Jessica asked gently. Eleanor nodded. "Seemed the right time." Jessica's eyes drifted upward to the balcony, where once Miriam had stood like a queen before her court. The silence that had reigned since her death wasn't mourning, it had been fear, confusion, maybe even complicity. But now the clocks ticked again, measuring time not as countdown, but as continuum. Jessica placed her hand lightly on the banister. She would leave soon, but the house, for all its secrets, had begun to breathe again. Her suitcase stood by the door, modest and worn. Jessica fastened the latch and glanced upstairs, unsure whether to wait or simply leave a note. But then she saw her. Clare stood at the second-floor window, framed by lace curtains. Her arms rested lightly on the sill, her eyes trained on something far away, or nothing at all. Jessica didn't wave, nor did Clare, but the stillness between them was not cold. It was something softer, a shared understanding bound by what had been spoken and what had not. The rain had begun, a soft, steady tapping on the glass, the kind that made no demands, only accompanied you. Clare's expression didn't change, but her fingers shifted slightly. A gesture, a pause, a farewell not quite named. Jessica turned the knob and stepped outside, her footsteps softened by the wet path. Behind her, the house stood still again, but not frozen. She did not look back, not out of indifference, but respect. Some goodbyes were too complex for words. The train platform was nearly empty, save for a few locals with umbrellas tilted against the drizzle. Jessica stood beneath the overhang, glancing down at her ticket, then at the tracks veiled in morning mist. A voice behind her cleared its throat. Heading out, she turned to find Sheriff Eddings. Same coat, same patient eyes. He held a paper cup of coffee and extended it without ceremony. She accepted it with a quiet smile. "I gather things are calmer at the Cargill place," he said, a touch of irony in his voice. "They're quieter," Jessica replied, which was not quite the same thing. The sheriff nodded slowly. "You've got a way of turning up at the right time, Mrs. Fletcher." "I don't know about that," she said gently. "Sometimes the story finds you, whether you want it or not." Eddings shifted his weight. "No need to file anything formal. Some things solve themselves, or don't." He tipped his hat, then added, "Safe travels." The train's horn sounded in the distance. Jessica watched the sheriff walk away without another word, his presence as brief and steady as the rain itself. The train pulled out of Bellwood with a slow, mournful shudder, carving a path through mist-laced fields and leafless trees. Jessica sat by the window, her notebook closed on her lap, her pen resting beside it, untouched. She wasn't writing, not yet. Instead she watched the countryside pass like a dream coming undone. Small farmhouses, rusted fences, a world going on with its quiet rhythms. How many families carried their secrets like heirlooms, buried in routine, and how many would crack, just a little, under the weight of one death? She thought of Clare's confession, not a murder of malice, but of fatigue, of sorrow, of silent desperation. Not justice, not vengeance, just release. The law had not been summoned, the press would not arrive, there would be no trial, no verdict, but the truth had been spoken, barely, and that was sometimes the bravest act of all. Jessica let out a slow breath. The line between justice and mercy, she thought, was rarely drawn in ink. More often it was etched in silence. Outside, the rain thinned, and a weak sun struggled behind the clouds. Jessica opened her notebook, wrote one word, Bellwood, and paused. Not every story needed to be told, but some needed to be remembered. Sometimes the deepest truths are spoken not aloud, but in the quiet between two people who understand each other without needing to explain. But tell me, was Clare's silence an act of mercy, or something far more complicated? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe really happened in that house? Share them with me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where justice and the human heart walk a delicate line, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe for more quiet unravelings yet to come.